Okay, picture this. It's October 1973. Out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, two of the most powerful navies on the planet are on a collision course, with their sailors' fingers literally on the trigger. Now, you might be thinking of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but this is a totally different story. It's a forgotten showdown, a tale of superpower brinksmanship that you probably never heard of, but one that brought the world terrifyingly close to World War III.
And just look at this picture. It captures the whole vibe perfectly, right? This is not just some staged photo op. It is raw, unfiltered hostility, hundreds of miles from anywhere. The tension between the U.S. 6th Fleet and the Soviet 5th Escadra was like a powder keg just waiting for a spark. And in 1973, that spark was about to be lit.
Now, here's what gets really chilling. That quote, "We are kamikazes," that's not some empty threat. That's a cold, hard assessment from a top Soviet naval commander on the scene. He was convinced that if a shooting war started, his fleet would get one shot, one single massive salvo before being utterly annihilated by American air power. It was an all-or-nothing, go-for-broke strategy. So how in the world did things get so desperate?
Well, to really get why 1973 was so explosive, we have to jump in our time machine and rewind about 10 years, back to a much more famous crisis, one that left a deep, painful scar on the entire Soviet Union.
Yeah, back during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the naval matchup wasn't even a fair fight. It was a joke. The U.S. Navy threw up a blockade with just overwhelming force, and the Soviet response? All they could muster were 4 old, clunky diesel submarines that could barely function in the warm Caribbean water. They were tracked down, forced to surface, and basically sent home with their tails between their legs. For Moscow, it was a national, profound, and utter embarrassment.
Cuba was the ultimate wake-up call for the Kremlin. They learned a brutal lesson. You can't play on the world stage, you can't be a real superpower, if you don't have a serious, blue-water navy that can project force thousands of miles from home. That humiliation lit a fire under them and kicked off a radical, breakneck transformation of the entire Soviet Navy.
So let's fast forward a decade, back to the Mediterranean. A completely different Soviet fleet has now shown up to the party, and it set the stage for this fascinating, lopsided rivalry with its American adversary.
You see, these two fleets were built on totally opposite ideas. The U.S. 6th Fleet was all about its aircraft carriers, these massive floating airfields that could control the skies for hundreds of miles. But those carriers were also giant, juicy targets. The Soviets knew they couldn't possibly compete in the air, so they came up with a different strategy: swarms of powerful anti-ship cruise missiles. We're talking about dedicated carrier killers, designed to do one thing and one thing only: sink an American carrier in the opening minutes of a war.
In this photo here, it just perfectly illustrates the Soviet situation and their clever workaround. See, the Americans had this whole network of friendly NATO bases all over the Mediterranean. The Soviets, they had nothing. So they created their own floating naval bases, just clustering their support ships and submarines together in international waters. It was definitely a makeshift solution, but it was incredibly effective at keeping a permanent, threatening force right on NATO's doorstep.
So you've got this incredibly fragile balance of power, this hair-trigger situation, and it was about to be put to the ultimate test. But the trigger wasn't pulled in Washington or in Moscow. It was pulled in the deserts of the Middle East. October 6, 1973. The Yom Kippur War explodes onto the scene, and right away, the superpowers get sucked in, backing their teams. First, the Soviets start this massive resupply effort to help Egypt and Syria. Not to be outdone, the U.S. responds by launching Operation Nickelgrass, this incredible airlift to save a desperate Israel. Just like that, a regional war was turning into a head-on superpower confrontation.
And the Soviets just flooded the zone with warships. At the absolute peak of the crisis, the 5th Escadra swelled to this number, 97. 97 warships crammed into the Med. That is an unbelievable concentration of firepower. All of a sudden, the sea was getting very, very crowded.
And believe me, this was not the same Navy from 1962. The Soviets were rolling out modern, nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarines, missile cruisers, the good stuff. And their mission was crystal clear: shadow every single American ship, especially the carriers, and be ready to launch the moment the order came through.
And that order came terrifyingly close to being given. As the war on the ground was reaching its fever pitch, the standoff at sea was escalating to its most dangerous point yet. So, on the ground, the Israeli army had managed to turn the tide and had completely surrounded an entire Egyptian army.
To save his ally from total humiliation, the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev sends this absolutely stunning message to the White House. He threatens to send Soviet troops to save the Egyptians, and he says he'll do it unilaterally if he has to. This was a direct challenge, a line in the sand.
The American response was fast, and it was loud. President Nixon ordered all U.S. strategic forces to DEFCON 3. And let's be clear, this was not a drill. This meant nuclear-capable bombers were being recalled to the U.S., an entire airborne division was put on standby. It was the highest state of military alert the U.S. had been in since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The message was unmistakable.
And out there on the waves, the American commander, Admiral Daniel Murphy, was feeling the pressure like you wouldn't believe. He said later that he calculated the odds of a Soviet first strike at a staggering 40%, almost a coin flip. He knew that if he saw even a hint of a missile launch, he would have to react instantly, with no time to call Washington for permission.
Meanwhile, the view from the Soviet side was just as terrifying. Captain Semenov, the guy we heard from earlier, described his fellow commanders as going berserk in unison. He actually wrote in his diary, "The pressure has reached the breaking point." For a few gut-wrenching hours, the entire world just held its breath. One wrong move, one tiny miscalculation from either side, and it all could have gone up in smoke.
In the end, that fatal shot was never fired. Diplomacy, fueled by the intense pressure of a potential world war, somehow managed to pull both sides back from the edge. But the crisis would leave a permanent mark on the world.
So, what happened? Well, a ceasefire was called, and the Egyptian army was saved. But the dominoes had already started to fall. Arab nations, absolutely furious at the U.S. for helping Israel, unleashed the oil weapon, causing a massive energy crisis around the globe. And here's the crazy twist. The crisis actually gave U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger the opening he needed. By basically saving Egypt from total destruction, he managed to kick Soviet influence out of Cairo and launch his famous shuttle diplomacy, which would completely reshape the entire Middle East for decades.
You know, this forgotten confrontation is such a stark reminder of just how fast a small, regional war can spiral out of control and pull the big players into a direct face-off. It's a powerful lesson from history, and it leaves us with a really important question for our time. As new global rivalries heat up and new flashpoints emerge around the world, could something like this happen all over again?